wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies in the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South explores the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truth and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
When most people think about the prototypical Southern Studies scholar, they likely think of someone born in the South who speaks with a slow Southern drawl that drips off the tongue like molasses. What they may not expect is a gentleman scholar from Great Britain with a smooth British accent and a passionate, unquenchable thirst to study Southern history, one who is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and is recognized by his peers as a preeminent scholar in sensory history. Today, we will have a conversation with your host, Dr. Mark Smith, as we flip the interview for this episode of Take on the South. We will explore the study of sensory history, an area of scholarship where Dr. Smith is known worldwide as an expert. We will discuss how Europeans view the South. We'll review how Dr. Smith came to the Institute for Southern Studies at USC and hear his thoughts on how the university has changed during his 30 years on campus. And finally, I'll ask for his take on whether Liverpool FC can continue its winning ways in the upcoming Premier League season. From fish and chips to fried chicken, let's explore Dr. Smith's journey from Great Britain to South Carolina and the many wonderful things that have followed from his decision to join and eventually lead the Institute for Southern Studies at USC. Mark, it's great to talk with you today. Thank you for allowing me to host your show.
Thanks for having me, Thad. I'm delighted to be here on strange terra firma.
Well, it's an odd side of the table for you, so I hope you can adjust
it is
quickly to it. So, Mark, let's get started. You are a Carolina Distinguished Professor of History here at USC, the Claude Henry Newford Chair in Southern Studies, Director of the Institute for Southern Studies. Therefore, when speaking to someone with so many titles, accolades, and awards in Southern history, I need to start a conversation with an essential question for every Southerner. What flavor of barbecue sauce is best? Mustard, ketchup, or vinegar-based?
The answer is fish and chips, obviously.
Fish and chips, okay. Well, I didn't include the Alabama white sauce, because that doesn't count. But
I would tell you that barbecue has been a hard acclimation for me. And it's not that I don't like it, it's just the subtleties have eluded me. And it's ironic because my colleague, Matt Simmons, is teaching a class on Southern barbecue. And he started it last year. It's immensely popular. I mean, within 72 hours, there's 100 students had signed up for this.
That's a class I want to audit.
You should. I mean, people love this thing. And we're going to expand it. And he's going to offer it again in the spring of 2026. And I went to visit him in that class. And I learned more in that one class about the varieties of cuts, tastes, than I have just living here, because it's not something that I normally eat. If I do eat it, though, I'm quite partial to the vinegar variety. So there is an answer.
The PD, Eastern North Carolina.
There's
PD
a PD,
version.
Eastern North Carolina. That's right.
You know, there was a geography professor here at one time who actually drew the map of the state, divided by barbecue sauce preferences.
Was that Chuck Kovacic?
I think it was.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, you know, most conversations between Southerners starts with some type of cuisine, Southern cuisine.
Right,
so
right.
I figure we need to start there.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you say y'all yet. I don't really hear that. I think I've heard it, but not really that often. But I really just want to find out, do you consider yourself a Southerner? And if you're willing to put on your professorial hat today, what does it mean to be a Southerner?
God, you're testing me on an afternoon here, aren't you? Well, first of all, I would tell you that I think one of the greatest gifts the Southern accent has given the United States, if not the world, is y'all. It's hard for me to say it because the way that it doesn't roll off my tongue like it does yours, but what a fantastic word, right? Much better than you all or yous guys. It provides a real function, and I love it. I think it's fantastic. Do I consider myself a Southerner? You know, first of all, I have to get to being an American, right? So there's a transitional issue. And I do consider myself American. I might not sound it, But I chose to be an American, which ultimately puts me in a relatively unusual position where you didn't choose, you are. But I elected to take the oath and become an American citizen with all of the privileges and responsibilities that entails. In terms of being Southern, that's a very, very interesting and difficult question for me to answer. My children are born in the South. My wife's from the South. I study Southern history. I came here to study the South. I think it would be a bit presumptuous, though, for me to claim Southernhood. But I will say I have an abiding love of the place. And ultimately, for me, Southernness is a kind of an aspiration, right? Like if somebody said to me, I consider you very Southern now, I'd consider that a compliment. But I don't think I'm ever going to get that compliment, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. What does it mean to be Southern? I think what it means to be Southern now is really, really quite different than what it meant to be 100 years ago, right? Largely because the demographics, because of people like me in a way, are drawn to this place for a variety of reasons, and people come for all sorts of reasons. I think that the place is marked by its diversity. I think it's a very kind of culturally diverse place, much more than people think it is. And I think it's a good thing. I think that it's marked by its hospitality. I know that is a trope that is often trotted out, but I think that it does have a certain hospitality. One of the reasons I live here is because I think people are pretty decent for the most part, and I enjoy their company, and I enjoy living in the South. And I have lived in the North too. No disrespect to the non-South, but I don't think I'd ever move. What it means to be a Southerner is such a fraught question academically. And it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I mean, it's a region that is fraught with its tensions and its history, some of which is very recent. It's a region that is, as C. Vann Woodward once said, the only region in the South that has a history of defeat, right? And that means something, and it certainly meant a lot more 100 years ago. I'm not sure how much cultural baggage it carries today, but certainly that memory has not evaporated. And then one of the things that is different, I think, today than it was 100 years ago, and again, Woodward made this point, the per capita income of the South did not equal the U.S. national per capita income until 1958. That's how long the legacy of the Civil War was economically on this region. Remember, prior to that, for all the wrong reasons, the South was one of the richest parts, and this state was one of the wealthiest states, and it was the wealthiest colony on the eve of the American Revolution. But the Civil War, it had an enormous economic impact, and it took until 1958 for the South to mainstream economically. Now look at it. I mean, South Carolina, largest immigration state in the nation. Where are people moving to? They're moving here. Where are businesses relocating to? Here. This is a kind of resurgent South, a Renaissance South, if you will. And I think that difference is the thing that really draws me. It's a growing place. It's exciting. I see this, and I told you this last time, I see that excitement for the region reflected in this university. It's a vibe. You can see it. You can feel it. And it's exciting to live here. It's not this backwater that people think it is. Now, I can talk about stereotypes all you want later on if you'd like. But for me, when I first came here in 1989 as a graduate student, all the stereotypes I had evaporated within about a year. Much more interesting place than I realized. I was interested in its history. I wanted that access point to its history, which is why I came. But living here taught me a great deal too.
When I was a federal law clerk, one of the most profound moments of my experience was the judge presiding over a naturalization ceremony, and just seeing the excitement in the families and the people who chose to be Americans and did the work to pass the test, do all the things that are required to be a naturalized citizen. And then and thinking about what you're sharing, and just thinking about this time together with you, is it possible for someone to adopt the region as their own, to where not only it's home, but they feel like they're a Southerner? And you say you don't feel like you're a Southerner. I just wonder if it's possible, particularly in the New South, where there's so many people coming here, and we have such tremendous growth, large urban areas that mirror a lot of the same communities across the country, and just so I just throw out the question: is it even possible?
Well, I think it is possible, and largely this might be just a function of my lack of own self-reflection on it, because I mean I'm so ensconced in studying its past. I wonder whether I'm really thinking about my situation in its present. Let me put it this way, and we'll go back to the naturalization issue. One of my dear departed friends was Judge Matthew Perry, and we'd see each other once a month in an organization, and I would talk to him about his own experiences in the civil rights movement, critically important, not just for South Carolina, but for the entire nation. I mean, this was a man of really textured, important history with a lot of gravity attached to it. And I enjoyed talking to him, and I learned a lot about the South through our conversations. Well, the Matthew J. Perry Federal Courthouse, that was when it first opened, it had the first naturalization ceremony there, and I was in it.
Oh.
And guess who swore me in? Judge Perry.
Wow.
And at the beginning of the ceremony, you have to stand up and you have to say, well, my name is, Joe Smith from Scotland or what have you, or so-and-so from Albania. And I got up and said, my name is Mark Smith from the United Kingdom. And Judge Perry said, Mark, it's lovely to see you here. And every other immigrant in that room thought I had a quick pass in or something like that, right? I suppose at that point, it was for me feeling American. If I kind of interrogate at a forensic level my daily life, yeah, sure, I see myself as Southern in that sense. I mean, I'm living in the South. I'm dealing with Southerners all the time, like all 24/7. I study I suppose at a certain level. Whether I feel like it is one question. Whether I'd be accepted as it is another.
Those are two very interesting questions. And today, how do you feel? But also, how do others feel depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And the mindset of where they are in their understanding of what it means to be a Southerner.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are some people, just like in England, it's like, well, you can never be an Englishman, right? You can't because you're not from here. And yet plenty of people who aren't born there feel fully English. But it's the subjective versus the objective, right? So you can feel Southern, but are you accepted as such? And even if you're not, I'm not sure that's necessarily a negative thing. People have all sorts of gatekeeping mechanisms in their world, and they want to let some people in and some people not. And I don't know what people think of me, and that's fine. I know my students are always surprised I'm teaching Southern or American history, and as I tell them, when we get to the Revolution, I might be a little bit biased, but not too much, because it was a draw after all, as we know. The American Revolution, bit iffy, You want to come back, I know. And my kids rag me all the time. It's like, well, we won the American Revolution. And do you know what my answer to that is? That's true, but what language do you speak? Oh, well, English, but American English. I was,
Well, I do believe that the South is more cultural. And it's not about accents or what you eat necessarily, and although those are part of it, but I think there's a lot more to it, and I think that's something that here in some of the classes that you and your colleagues talk about when you talk about the New South and where we've been, but really where we are now and where we're going. On another day, I'd love to talk to you about Judge Perry. I had the opportunity to go to an event with him and spend a day with him at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and by accident ended up in a 101 dinner with him that night. Fascinating, not only because of who he is, but also just as a lawyer, being able to sit with him and ask him questions, and he was an open book. It was fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. So let's step back.
Okay.
Where are you from originally? Tell us about your family. What is your upbringing?
So my dad was in the army. He was in the British Army for 22 years, and that meant that I grew up in a variety of places, most notably in the south of England, Suffolk, and then Berlin.
So south of England.
Yeah, south of
south.
England. It was south of London, that's for sure. Suffolk, north of London. But I suppose one of my principal memories growing up wasn't in the UK. It was actually in a little slice of America, which was called West Berlin at the time. And as you know, the agreement after the Second World War was to petition West Berlin, and it was going to be jointly managed by the French, the English, and the Americans. Well, it turns out the Americans took most of the responsibility on that. And they established these Air Force bases, and there was a big one in West Berlin. But the British troops were deployed there, and so back then, in the 70s, you could take your family. And so Dad took me and my mum, and I grew up on an American Air Force base, which, if people haven't been on American military bases abroad, they're really interesting places. They are small islands of America because the television is American, the radio is American, the food is American. I mean, going to the PX, I had McDonald's before it made it to England, right? So I know a lot about 1970s American TV shows, largely because I'm in West Berlin watching this stuff. And I think I certainly became familiar with Americana in Berlin. And my dad was, he didn't rise high in the ranks. He was a corporal by the time he left after 22 years. He didn't want to rise above that. But I'll always thank him for, A, introducing me to that, and then B, for keeping my nose to the grindstone. I mean, I come from a very working class family. We weren't rich. My parents graduated school. They didn't go to college. Nobody entire family had gone to college. And I guess I got lucky, and he and my mum were very good at keeping me on task. And I ended up going to the University of Southampton. They were very proud. I was a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was doing, And back then, it was actually really difficult to get into the university system because they were small. I think Southampton, which was one of the biggest universities, had like 2,000 students. Like only something like 6 or 7% of 18-year-olds went to university then. It's much bigger now. It's more American now, so in the 30s, 35, 36%. But when I graduated with my BA in history and sociology, I looked into going into the army because, my dad had been in the army. And with a BA in England at the time, you could go in as a non-commissioned officer. And I wanted to go into the Ordnance Corps, which is pretty much like logistics, right? It's where UPS and FedEx were born, right? And he said, "What do you think I've been doing here? Do you think I've been supporting you for all these years so you can go into the bloody army?" And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Look, it's a much bigger world than that. I gave you a little slice of it, but explore." And he told me not to go into the army, and I'm really glad that he did, because it opened up paths for me that otherwise I wouldn't have chosen.
So you go to Southampton. From there, you decide not to go to the army. What's next?
Well, this is a story of happenstance and a little bit of courage, and a great deal of support. So when I was in my second year, bear in mind that a degree in England is 3 years because you have 2 years of college before you go to university. But in my second year, there was a professor who was on an exchange, and he came from the University of South Carolina. And he taught a course on the American South. His name was Rob Weir. Right. And he was a very well-known colonial specialist. And I would bug him. I mean, I took his class and I got so interested in it. I would ask him all sorts of questions, and he'd give me the books to read, or he'd give me the answers. And it got to the point, Thad, where he said, look, I can't answer these questions. You're asking me questions about, I was interested in antebellum slavery as a colonial specialist. He said, I can't answer these. And he said, and frankly, I'm not sure what books to recommend. He did recommend one book that I read with great enthusiasm called Roll, Jordan, Roll by Eugene Genovese, one of the greatest Southern historians ever. And that was a fantastic book, and it only just whet my appetite, and I'd still bug him about questions. He said, look, why don't you come over and do an MA at the University of South Carolina, and you can go down to the archives. There's the South Carolina Library. It's fantastic. We have the archive. The archives back then were just across the road. He said, you can answer all these questions and get a degree at the same time. So Professor Weir was extremely instrumental in getting me here, because back then, it wasn't as easy to be a foreign student coming in with funding, right? Because you couldn't work, so you needed university funding, so I became a TA. You got to bear in mind, the largest class I had been in at the University of Southampton was maybe 15, 20 people, right? So I come here in July of 1989, and I get off the aircraft, and I mean literally get off the aircraft onto the tarmac at the airport, because they had stairs. There's no concourse back there, right? And I thought to myself, this is really hot. This is really hot. No internet, couldn't do a whole lot of research on the place. It was an act of faith and just pure inquisitiveness. It was risky. I didn't know where I was going, but I had faith in him. He said, you're going to get a degree, a master's degree, and you're going to be able to answer these questions that you've asked me. So I get here and I go through this orientation, and the first class I'm a teaching assistant for is now what is the Gambrell Auditorium. Holds about 250 students. I was the only TA. I was it. And the professor assigned blue book essays. So there I am, overwhelmed. I was like, how am I going to grade these? This is just wild. But I found my footing. Oh, and by the way, like a month later, Hurricane Hugo hit. I was like, what am I doing here? Right? What am I doing here? And but I found my footing. I took the classes. I became absolutely fascinated. And I went to the archives a lot. I mean, most of my education was obviously in the classroom, but a lot of it was just going to the archives, reading manuscripts. And I had some fantastic teachers that allowed me, as a non-Southerner, to experiment with different sources. And I'll always be grateful to those professors, because they knew I was a little bit out of my water, but I was hungry. And so they wanted to give me access to things that you wouldn't normally do. For example, I remember Clyde Wilson, and we're very different people, Clyde and I, but I took a class with him, research seminar, and he let me transcribe a plantation journal, which is not standard scholarship. Normally you write something based on lots of sources, but I learned more from transcribing that plantation journal. William John Connors from Lancaster County was a planter from 1840 to 42. These were several hundred pages. I transcribed every word, learned about cotton cultivation, learned about how slavery worked. I don't think I would have learned as much if I'd have done it differently. And, you know, I became very enamored of the place and the people once I started to take classes here, interact with the students, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot quickly because I had to.
So I mentioned how the South as a region captivated you and caused you to want to study it, and you made it your life's work. Dr. Edgar always told us that Europeans were fascinated with the South, particularly around the Civil War, but really, the South as a region. You mentioned you were interested in the colonial antebellum South. I went back and listened to episode 0 of the podcast, September 2021. And among other things, you mentioned that Southern Studies is a look at the influence of the South and influences on the South. So tell me two things. One, what about it caught your eye, and caused you to cross the pond and come here to study? But tell me why it's important for you to be studying the South?
So my first publication had nothing to do with American or Southern history. It was actually on immigration to Britain in 1948 from Jamaica. And it was on the Empire Windrush, and I wrote my senior thesis on that, and it became an article. But at the same time, I was much more interested in this question of the South. To answer your question is a bit complicated, but I'll try to make it straightforward. So here we have a South that contemporary eyes see as very backward, right? This is your Jim Dickey, it's a backward place. And yet, it fought a civil war, nearly won, was the wealthiest part of the United States on the eve of the Civil War, and yet we think of it as backward. The entire tourist industry surrounding the South casts the South as kind of nostalgic, not modern, as a place to escape. And of course, this was picked up by Southerners themselves after the Civil War, when Florida started to advertise itself to wealthy, middle-class New Yorkers and people in Boston to come south and escape the gnawing difficulties of modernity and relax in Florida, right? So this starts in the 1870s. So there's this whole raft of stereotypes about the South that are carefully created and cultivated as the South is backward. But as I'm reading some of the sources, I realize that slavery is extremely profitable, that it's capitalistic. It has a division of labor. It produces more wealth than anywhere else. And I was like, hang on a minute, why are we not talking about that South, right? That's the thing that got me into this. And that's why I came, because those are the questions I would ask Professor Weir. Did they use a division of labor? So, well, yeah, they did, but, more work needs to be done on it. How efficient were plantations was one of my questions. Some people had sort of delved into that, but I don't think that the question had been answered fully. So that's my personal experience. But the reason why the South is important is in a way connected to my studies on immigration as an undergraduate student. You cannot profitably or properly understand the history of the UK or Europe without understanding the history of cotton. We tend to think that South Carolina was kind of dragged into the global economy with BMW or something. No, it had always been there. You cannot have a transatlantic economy without South Carolina or the South. The South was really the reason why you had an industrial revolution. Cotton was affordable. They exported it. A very sophisticated marketing system with factors and all sorts of insurance agents got that cotton to the north, got that cotton to England, got that cotton to Europe. Those places exported finished goods to the South. There was a very tightly braided connection between the South and the Atlantic world for centuries, right? And that's why it's important in a way, because recognizing that connection recognizes the transatlantic responsibility for slavery, right? Because they're intimately connected. It recognizes the South as an integral part of that capitalist system, that it's not this backward place, that it was in fact very forward-looking. And recognizing that the movement of goods, people, services, and ideas was not interior, it was exterior. Southerners, were an important part of those transatlantic conversations about literature, art, commerce, you name it. And to see it unto itself is to deny its true core. So that's why I think Southern studies and Southern history has had this real purchase in the UK, because people are kind of curious about it like I was, like, hang on a minute, how did this place become backward when it was so modern? And B, to understand yourself in the UK, you have to understand the South, right? And by equally, if you to understand the South, you have to understand something about those trade mechanisms between the North, the South, the UK, the South, and Europe in the South.
You're right. That is a more complicated issue when you think about it. And when I was hearing Dr. Edgar talk about Europeans and their interest in the South, I didn't really understand why. The way you explained it makes sense. I get it. I didn't know if they were watching Gone with the Wind and all of a sudden they want to hear more about it.
Well, they might be a part of it.
Might be some people, but obviously yours is much more involved. Your interest is much more involved, much more complicated, and so you came here and you're studying these questions that you asked Dr. Weir, and then you decided to proceed on to a PhD.
I did, and I'll tell you why. I think I've received a lot of support from faculty here to say, like, Mark, you're onto something. Because I'd started dabbling in this question of time, right? And I started to look at how plantations use clocks and watches to manage labor. So one of the great stereotypes of the South is, enslaved people work from sun up to sundown. And there is a certain truth to that. But I couldn't figure out why so many planters had clocks and watches, and why they never allowed enslaved people to have a clock or watch, if it was sun up to sundown. And the reason why is because they were using time to maximize labor. So plantations are often very large places. If you're going to get your enslaved workforce from their cabins, their quarters, to number 10 cotton field, that could be a couple of miles away. If you get them up at sun up, you're going to lose an hour. So they get them up for the sun up so they're in the field by the time the sun comes up. And that requires a mechanical sense of time. And from that, I started to discover that the world's longest railroad with timed deliveries was the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad. It was, in fact, the first railroad in the world to have its own time zones. Time zones in this country didn't come around until 1883, long after the end of the Civil War. In the 1830s, the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad had its own time zones. Why? Because they had contracted with the United States Postal Service to deliver the mail on time. So Time was my first book, right? But I started that with a master's thesis. And I was working with Thavolia Glimpf and Lacey Ford, Clyde Wilson, people from very different backgrounds, but they all saw some worth in it. But the catalyst for this, the reason I decided to stay, in addition to all the things I just told you, was back then there was a Graduate History Association, and there is one now too, and I think they're very important. And I gave my first paper at the Graduate History Association in Gambro Hall, just down the road, just literally 100 feet from here. And I framed my paper as a critique of Eugene Genovese, the historian I mentioned earlier that I'd read as an undergraduate in Southampton. And I framed it as a critique. And I said, and I was young, I was bumptious and arrogant. I framed this and I said, Genovese is deeply mistaken, wrong on every point, doesn't understand the history of time. We should really just dispense with this book. It's old now. It's written in 1974. It's time to move on. So I give this paper and I get a lot of pushback. I mean, there are students in the audience, like graduate PhD students. I'm doing my master's and they're just hammering me. I'll leave. We finish up, and I'm pushing back, and we end it. And I walk outside. And back then, I smoked cigarettes. Terrible habit. Don't do it, children. And I had a cigarette outside. Well, this bloke comes up to me, and he says, "That's an interesting paper." I said, "Well, thanks, yeah." And he lit up his own cigarette. He said, "I'd like to read it." I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." He said, "I'm Eugene Genovese." I was, "Oh, God, really? Of course you are. Of course you are." And this, you have to understand, this man is at the height of his powers. He doesn't really need to deal with students. He read that paper. He gave me 8 single-spaced pages back. He lived in Atlanta with his wife, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, an equally well-known historian. And he said, you should continue with this. He said, half of it's wrong, but the other half is not wrong. He said, I disagree with you. I think what you're doing is really interesting. I disagree with your interpretation, but go with it. You're onto something interesting here. And at that point, I decided to apply for PhD programs. Thavolia Glimpf directed my MA thesis, and then Lacey Ford ended up taking me on as a PhD student because Thavolia left for Penn, I think. And I applied to other places too. I applied to Princeton and Columbia, and I got in. I just didn't get any money. But I got money here, so I stayed. And I'm really glad that I stayed because I think our archives are far superior to anyone else's. And I took Genovese's advice. I wrote a dissertation on that, which became a book called Master by the Clock, which I published in 1997. I got a job just before I finished. I went back to the UK, taught at the University of Birmingham for a couple of years, and then came back here, which was odd at first, maybe for a couple of weeks, but faculty were very welcoming. We had a few people that had their PhDs from USC, including Lacey. And I just fell back into where I was and started to work very hard. And Genovese and I remained friends up and when he passed. I had the honor of writing his obituary. It's a very poignant relationship, and I just think it's one of those illustrations where take a chance, come to a different place, learn from your faculty, but also listen to people who aren't necessarily teaching in a direct fashion. They can be extremely handy, and if they're of generous spirit, you will flourish.
So when you came back, did you come back as part of the Institute for Southern Studies? Was that?
I did not. Okay. I knew Walter, and we were friends. We became very close friends later on. But I was firmly ensconced in history, doing Southern history. But I would do things with the Institute, papers, presentations, things like that. But Walter was running this institute so well, he didn't need my help. I mean, he made it what it is today. What Walter Edgar did was essentially make the foundation of the Institute for Southern Studies.
Let's talk about the Institute. So you're now the director.
Yep.
Yeah, and so Walter started it. Is that correct?
Well, I think Jim Merriweather started it. Then Walter took it over and made it, what it becomes.
So what is the purpose for the Institute now? Your vision for it and for within the university, what is the purpose and what are you trying to accomplish?
So the Institute for Southern Studies is fundamentally, at base, an interdisciplinary institute. So it's not just history, it's not just literature, it's anthropology, public health, sociology, music. And it's designed to, kind of gather as much information about the South so we can teach our students about it, but then also generate information about the South. So one of the jobs is to disseminate what you're discovering. And when I became director, 4 years ago, I wanted to do it. I wanted to build on Walter's foundational work, and then Bob Brinkmeyer, who was the following director, who did a fantastic job. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So, for example, we still bring in lecturers to talk. And that's great, and that's what we'd always done. But the world was becoming a bigger place. Walter and Bob Brinkmeyer really didn't have access to the kind of technology that I had access to when I came on. So I wanted to deploy that technology. So rather than bringing somebody in and having 30 or 40 or 50 people listen to the lecture, I want to do that, but I want to make sure that their words are disseminated even more widely and in perpetuity. So that's why we established the podcast. So Take on the South is a deliberate attempt to disseminate that information and to make it something of a resource for people interested in things that are Southern, right? So that's one thing that we did, and everything I've tried to do has really been public facing. Rather than keep information within these four walls, let's get that information out to the world. So that has taken the form of an app that we established, that we developed, and that app was funded through a private foundation, the Watson Brown Foundation. It's a fantastic app. Students use it all the time when they come to campus. It's Explore SC. We had a podcast on it, and it would tell you where you are, historic meaning of where you are, the markers. You can read it, and it's a really wonderful kind of resource. Parents like it. You can use it throughout the state too. It's not just Columbia. We have lots of projects that are student driven. I think it's very important to bring students in at the very baseline of knowledge production about the South. So students will engage in lots of transcriptions for us, which are then run through AI, which will then be put on the web so that people can ask about any material question from the 19th and 18th century about, what did people own? What did they have? And as you know, the podcast has done very well because I decided that we would have two highlights of the year. We run, many podcasts, but I wanted to bring in well-known people or people who are well-respected in their views of the American South. So we have two principal donors. One is the Nipher family, and Francis Nipher has been extremely helpful with this. So we established the Nipher Lecture in Southern Literature that we have every autumn, and we've brought in those folks. So we'll bring in, say, Ron Rash. A lot of people turned up, but we'll also interview him on the podcast. And then probably the most important donor for the Institute was Governor McNair. And so I just decided to honor his legacy and what he's done for Southern Studies by establishing a McNair lecture every year. And we've had some fantastic people. Thavolia Glimpf, my former mentor, who's now at Duke, a very distinguished historian, was our first. Lou Kennedy, CEO of Nephron Pharmaceuticals, great business leader, great example of Southern business women. Chief Justice Jean Toll was another one of our McNair honorees. Absolutely fascinating conversation. And the Chief Justice really just taught me a lot in that conversation about what it meant to grow up here and what it meant. How did a woman become Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court? Absolutely fascinating. And last year we had, of course, Michael Stipe, former lead singer of REM, and it blew the house off. I mean, we had it in the Koger Center, 2,000 people turned up. This is what I want. The more, the merrier. Dissemination, high-quality production, high-quality knowledge, and engagement. If I can do those, I'm doing my job. And that is my signature for this. Pushing forward, more public, more open, really engaging the general public, students, and the faculty at the University of South Carolina.
Well, it looks like you're there. I mean,
we're getting there.
I was at the Stipe podcast taping with everyone else at the Koger Center. It was fantastic, great experience. So with your scholarship, you are a world-renowned expert in sensory history. And several years ago during an interview, you said the trick with sensory history is that it's low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we need to study sensory history, and how do you study it?
You did your research, didn't you? The low-hanging fruit, but that's good.
My day job, I do some research every now and then.
Yeah, you're a busy man, though, but So sensory history is a way of looking at the past that takes vision seriously, because that's what we do, right? We're always looking at the past. We rely on eyewitnesses, principally. And as an attorney, you know that, right? But people exist in a multisensory fashion, don't they? So we don't just see things. We smell them, we taste them, we touch them, we hear them. And one of the oddities about historical writing is that for many, many years, it treated people in the past as just eye people, right? And it didn't really pay attention to what they heard or what they smelled or what they touched or what they tasted or what they thought about those things. So sensory history includes the other senses in an examination of the past. And it's low-hanging fruit, Thad, because it's everywhere. You don't need to find new sources for this. They're embedded in things that are deeply familiar to people. It just depends how you read the source. If you are a child of the Enlightenment, which is a very ocular, eye-driven legacy, then you're going to look for eyewitness accounts. But if you suspend that and say, hang on a minute, is that really all the Enlightenment was about? Then you're going to find people listening in letters, and they would talk about what they heard. They talk about what they smelled and how they use smell either to empower themselves or to undermine other people or to verify things. So that's what sensory history does. The trick to it is it has to be contextualized. So, for example, how we smell something or hear something is not going to have the same meaning as somebody in the past, right? So if I say to you, what does a tornado sound like? You would say, what?
A freight train.
A freight train, right. Why? Because we exist in a society with freight trains. That doesn't mean to say there weren't tornadoes in 1600. There were. But they could not possibly sound like a freight train, could they? They might sound like God's wrath or something that had currency at the time. That's the key to it. And that's really what historians do anyway. But we have to be very careful to contextualize how people understood those sensory experiences in the time that they experienced them. So that's what I've been doing really since I think after my first book, I started, time was a very auditory thing, so I kind of got onto it then. Mm-hmm. I've been doing it a long time, and I've written a fair few things on it. Not all of them are that good, to be honest with you, but my aim here is to just remind readers, that the past is a much more textured experience than just seeing.
What's the most interesting thing you've learned studying sensory history?
God, that's a hard question. I'm finishing a book right now, so I find that much more interesting than the stuff I've done before. But I would say, for me, one of the most interesting things and one of the most poignant things was you can't understand the history of race in the South without understanding the history of the senses and how the senses were used to not just undermine and denigrate people, but empower certain people, but also to invent the idea of race. And, I wrote a book years ago called How Race is Made, and it's all about that. And the examples I chose were, those examples illustrated with kind of crushing precision how race was made in a non-visual way. And that's probably the most interesting and enduring and most important work I've done. I've written on the sensory history of the Civil War, which I think is also important. The experience of war as a sensory assault is important to recognize because it does remind you, be careful before you get into war. It's not just about the glory and the flags. It's about the smell of death. It's about the denigration of your diet. It's about the ear-splitting sounds that you have never heard before. So I do think there's a kind of relevance. I don't tend to write my work as relevant work. There's to say, well, read this, you'll understand the present now much more. It's a bit more subtle than that. But I do think that those two things probably are the most legacy-filled parts of sensory history that I've delved into.
So as we wrap up, you just mentioned battle. Let's pivot to a different type of battle on the pitch. So Liverpool won the Premier League, but had some bumps in international play. Didn't do so well in the FA Cup. Runner-up in the EFL.
Yeah.
Arne Slot's done a nice job.
Yeah.
What can we expect from Liverpool? They just picked up Wirtz. So what can we expect from Liverpool this coming season?
Okay, well, look, you actually know way more about this than I do, okay, because you are a genuine fan of the modern era, right? You have to remember, when I started supporting Liverpool, there was no Premier League, right? This is 1970s, 1980s England. And as a young lad, growing up in a small town with a 4th Division team, which was known principally for its violence on the terraces, I couldn't support that stuff. So I looked around. My dad is from East London. He was like, well, you got to support a London team. I was like, no, I don't. I'd never been north of London, right? And what was the preeminent team in the 70s and 80s? It was Liverpool. It was the only team really with any real European footprint. They won the UEFA Cup, the FA Cup, the League Cup. They had Kevin Keegan in the 70s, Ray Clements, one of the greatest goalkeepers ever, in my opinion. I know Peter Shilton was very good, but, I think Ray Clements was probably better. And so, of course, I was enamored of this, and I got seduced by it, and I became a big supporter. Many years later, I gave a talk at the University of Liverpool and went on the pitch at Anfield, which is really small. The Kop is really small. Like, you would be shocked at how it makes. Williams-Brice makes Anfield look tiny. It is, but intimate, right? Like, you can see things up close. So, when the Premier League comes along, I've already lived here lots of years, right? And I am not following UK Premier League soccer. I look at the scores with some interest. And then all these teams, when I was growing up, there were Division 3 and Division 4. Bournemouth? Really? I was shocked.
I think you opened with Bournemouth this year.
Right. I mean, that was not a team of any worth back then. And what the Premier League did was make it a better league. You could only have a small percentage of foreign players in the 70s and 80s. Premier League changed that, and that internationalized it, right? And then, of course, the Football Association in the UK looked to America. How do you popularize this? And they modeled it on American football. And the beautiful irony, both internationally and personally for me, is that I know way more about SEC American football now than I do about FA Cup soccer.
Well, it's almost time for your SEC preview, USC football season preview that you do with your son. So I know that'll be coming up, and maybe people will come back to the podcast for that. Maybe some more discussion about soccer history. You just gave us a quick rundown. But thank you, Mark, for allowing me to host your show today. Thank you for sharing your experience here, coming to USC, your experience here in Southern Studies. And thank you for what you're doing as a member of the faculty here at the University of South Carolina. Very proud of what you've done here with the Institute.
Well, Thad, thank you for having me on Take on the South. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Be sure to click and subscribe. Take on the South is produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our soundtrack. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.